Okay, good evening, everybody. I want to welcome all of you and those of you who are coming in live on the live stream. This very special event we have tonight, which is sponsored by all the LA-based anti-occupation organizations, Jewish ones that I know of. So we have, if not now, LA Jews for Peace, JVP UCLA, JVP LA, and hosted here at the community center by the East Side Jew. I'm Leah. I'm not really affiliated with any of these groups, but I support everything they all have to say. And we have a really exciting lineup planned for tonight. We have Haggai Matar here, who's the executive director of Plus 972 magazine, an independent news outlet of incredibly talented Israeli and Palestinian journalists to report live from events on the. And he's here to talk to us about what's happening with all of the protests that most of you have seen in the news, the increasingly fascist government, which has also been in the news, and the violence towards Palestinians living under apartheid, which is less in the news. So I am about to pass it over to the guy. He's gonna do his thing, and then we're gonna open it up to a Q&A. And don't mind the little babbler in the back. He's mine and he has opinions, and we're trying to educate them from when they're young.
And if I may, so if anyone needs the bathroom, there are bathrooms inside the building. You'll go through a door. There's a hallway that'll take you to the bathrooms. And if you speak, just once we open for discussion, just be sure to speak loudly so the folks online can hear you. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so hi everyone. Really thank you for coming. Thank you to all the organizers for organizing. It's been lovely to be here. There's so much going on right now in Israel Palestine. There's tons of things, and we will not be able to cover them all. And still, I want to start with something that happened many years ago, because it's pretty relevant. About 20 years ago, I refused the draft, and I was court-martialed, me and a bunch of my friends. And the army tried to kind of make an example of us because there were so many conscientious directors at the time, from the height of the Second Intifada, and they tried to make an example of us, kind of stop that wave of refusal. And we tried to kind of split that trial and kind of turn it into a platform to kind of put occupation trial. And we were trying about, and we all kind of had our testimonies explaining why we did the draft and why our Congress did not allow us to go in the army. And each of us kind of detail all the things that we've seen and heard and have become aware of in terms of what that petition is about. And then the trial ended. And in his closing arguments, the prosecutor, the army prosecutor, had this very dramatic speech where he tried to kind of break down all of our arguments. And he took kind of handpicked from all these different arguments that we made, all the things we said are the core reason why we're refusing. And then he started saying, well, you're saying that settlements are war crimes, but the Supreme Court approved settlements. You're saying that the separation wall is a war crime, but the Supreme Court approved the separation fence. You're saying that house demolitions, administrative detention, ethnic cleansing, targeted assassinations, all these things are war crimes, but all of them were approved by the Supreme Court. So how can you stand here and say that these are illegitimate, that they're illegal? And he was right. And since then, the Supreme Court continued approving bombings of Gaza from the air and the complete destruction of entire communities, of entire villages, snipers shooting at demonstrators. All of these things are continuously approved by the Supreme Court. Just recently, fast forward 20 years, just recently I was in a protest in Tel Aviv, one of the huge demonstrations that have been going on. About 200,000 people in the street. Meanwhile, there are dozens of demonstrations in other cities. Just to give you a sense, about 19% of Israeli citizens have participated in protests over the past few months. try and think what that would look like in the US, just there. 200,000 people might not sound like a lot here, but think about that kind of scale, it's huge. So I was in one of those talks in Tel Aviv, and on stage was Moshe Bughi Ya'alon, former chief of staff, former defense minister, and war criminal. And what he was saying basically was this: he was saying, kind of picking up on that prosecutor's line from 20 years before, he was saying, the only reason that I'm not tried for war crimes by international tribunals is the Supreme Court. The appearance, he didn't say appearance, of course, but the fact we have an independent prosecution and judicial system is what prevents foreign countries and the international institutions they take to prosecute me and other soldiers and generals and politicians for war crimes. If that is taken away by this government, if they basically destroy the court system, we will be exposed. And he's not alone in it. Many of the people that are coming out right now to the protests are doing so because they're really afraid that without the appearance of an independent judiciary, they might face charges of war crimes internationally. So what is actually going on? If the Supreme Court has approved all these things, if it's greenlighting all these war crimes, why is the far-right government going after the Supreme Court? I'm going to pause on that question a little bit and give some background about the work that we do and how we see and have seen reality over the past decade or so to explain how we got to this place. So Week 972 Plus 972 magazine, which is in English, and Local Call, which is in Hebrew. We're a team of Palestinian and Israeli journalists. Most of us are on the ground throughout Israel, Palestine. And what we try to do is the three very basic things that we feel that mainstream media is failing at. One is offer reliable information about things that matter. Two is offer a helpful framework of analysis, how to understand that political reality on the ground. And three is to offer alternatives to what things might look like if we were to move away from the current system of apartheid. And focusing on that second article of analysis, for many years now, we've been trying to tell people that the framework of understanding that says, well, there's a democratic Israel in this old borders of up until 67 that's temporarily occupying several territories, and there will be eventually a two-state solution, and there's negotiations just about to happen. And that framework of understanding that's usually being presented by diplomats and the international community and mainstream media is just wrong. It's deeply, deeply flawed. Because no matter what end solution might be, what you might want it to be, there's on the ground, there's a one-state reality. And reality was there's only one power, there's only one state, there's only one regime, and it's throughout the land in different ways, in different mechanisms, sustains a system of Jewish supremacy. Wherever there are Jews and Palestinians, Jews will always be superior. There are different laws, and Palestinians are broken up, some have more rights, some have less. But the governing regime throughout the land is that of Jewish supremacy. And that was one thing we've been saying for since 2010 when 972 started. The other thing that we've been saying increasingly over those 10 years is how normalized that situation has become within Israeli society. So it's important to recognize that in the past, in the 90s, the early 2000s, the issue of occupation or apartheid or generally of what to do with Palestinians was something that was being discussed. It was the main issue of politics. Parties were broken up based on their answers to those questions. And the main project of Netanyahu, the biggest success of Netanyahu over his second tenure from 2009 to 2021, was basically to remove that issue from the table entirely, to normalize the situation, to tell people and sell the narrative saying, we will forever live on our sword, we will forever be in this situation, we will sustain this status quo, which is not a status quo, it's gradual annexation, constantly happening, but we will sustain this system, and there is no alternative, basically killing out the imagination of a different world, different reality. To the point that if you look at the opposition parties, all of them have adopted the same line. And when in 2021, Netanyahu was finally ousted for 1 year, and there was a new government put in place of the opposition, including left parties, including the Palestinian party, and it was called as the government of change. It accepted that exact narrative. It's continued with that rationality. We're going to keep things as they are. We're not going to change things. Not only that, that same government was responsible for the killing of more Palestinians than we've seen for more than a decade, the demolition of more houses of Palestinians throughout the land than we've seen for more than a decade, more administrative detentions, and so on and so forth. So even that opposition, so-called, to Netanyahu was basically de facto doing the same sort of thing. Now, while that has worked, generally speaking, for Netanyahu, like that system, sustain that system has worked for many, many years, and he was able to prove to his opponents that there is no international backlash. In 2009, 2010, people were saying the world will not allow us to continue this way. And Netanyahu said the world is going to become more like us, and we will have to be like them. And he was right. And people were saying, well, if we want peace with the Arab world, we will have to end the occupation. But no, we can have peace with the Arab world without ending the occupation. He was right. The Abraham Accords basically proved it right. So for many years, he was able to show we really don't need to end up until May of 2021, which I think is a very important moment where what Palestinians call the uprising of unity took place, where at the same time in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, within Israel, people were uprising and demonstrating, protesting the system of government, including setting up, in some cases, militias where Palestinians were attacking Jews, and Jews were setting up militias attacking Palestinians. People were attacking their neighbors. So that appearance of a sustainable status quo that Netanyahu was selling for so long was starting to collapse. But with the opposition not offering any alternative, people didn't get any answers to what can we do as this system is collapsing. We don't have an opposition saying, well, maybe we should talk about equality, maybe we should talk about justice, maybe we should talk about ending apartheid. That was not an option on the table. And instead, a new option was presented, that of the far right, where Itamar Ben-Gvir, Kahanist, Bezalel Smotrich were coming in and saying, we have an alternative to the status quo. Everyone else is telling you the same thing, whether it's Bennett or Lapid or Gantz and Netanyahu, they're all telling you the same thing. There's a sustainable status quo. We're saying the status quo isn't sustainable, as you see. And we have a solution. The solution is to go further than we've ever done before. If the Supreme Court has allowed all these terrible things, but it's put very limited boundaries. So, for example, it said you can build settlements, but you can't build settlements on privately owned Palestinian land. You can demolish entire villages if you deem them legal, but if they are legal, you can't demolish entire villages. Well, then the Smotrich are coming in and saying even those very small limitations the court has put in place are bad. They're they're leftist. They're harmful to our effort to sustain Jewish supremacy throughout the land. And that's where they're coming in and challenging that system. That's where the Kohelet Forum, that was founded and is funded by American Jews, Arthur Danchik and Jeff Gass, who are embedded with Koch brothers and Federalists here in promoting anti-abortion legislation and all sorts of terrible things here, have been supporting these moves to deepen apartheid, to attack the judicial system, to sustain even more of Jewish supremacy than we've ever had before. So these different forces have allied with fanatic religious movements trying to promote Jewish law over civilian law that we have in Israel, with the extreme right saying we should promote ethnic cleansing, with the Kohelet Forum supporting the same sort of message, with Netanyahu and some of his partners that are facing criminal charges for corruption and basically trying to append the legal system to allow for public corruption to be legal. So we have all these allies partnering against the judicial system, against the media, against the academia, and they're against the unions. They're going after everyone at the same time. And I think the reason is many are saying, well, why did they choose to go after everyone at the same time? They're alienating so much of the public. I think the reason is that there's been so much political instability in Israel for the past few years. Is when this government was sworn in early January, they felt like we don't know how much we're going to be here in power. It's not like the US, if you know that the president is elected every 4 years, no matter what. In Israel, you can have elections within 2 months. We've had that. We've had 5 elections in 4 years. So that this government came in saying we have to do everything immediately. And that created a backlash, the kind of which we've never seen before. Definitely with Palestinians that have been continuously resisting these moves since May of 2021. And also really in an unprecedented fashion in the Israeli public, where you have protests so huge, the kind of which we've not seen before. We have, to a certain degree, the unions, the universities, the municipalities joining in the protest movement. We have parts of the army, parts of the police, government officials, not the ministries, but the people in public servants working in ministries saying you're going too far with this. So the far right is met with such a position that is feeling limited. But all this opposition, as I was saying before, is not challenging those core assumptions, those core drives of the far right that are motivating this attack on the judiciary and the media and so on. They're just saying, well, it started by saying, pause this judicial overhaul. Don't pass these few bills. That's all we're asking for. That was when the protest started about 3 months ago. And when very few people out of 200,000 people in Tel Aviv, you have like 500 people in the anti-apartheid bloc waving Palestinian flags and saying no to apartheid. Those people were being beaten up by other demonstrators and yelled at and verbally abused because the other demonstrators were saying, we don't want you here. Like, this is what this is about. And we only want to focus on the judicial overhaul. The same was happening in the opposition in the Knesset, where you have the Jewish opposition parties that were holding press conferences and not inviting the Arab parties in the opposition, basically saying this is a Jewish-only struggle. So as this is happening, and as we have war criminals playing a central role in this movement and saying we're doing this to allow for war crimes, basically, that's why we're having this movement. Things have begun to change. Gradually, we're seeing both the tactics of this movement and the contents and the values that are driving this movement shift. And they're shifting week after week. You can actually see it bubbling from the ground up. On the side of the tactics, we're seeing such things that until recently were only used by Palestinians and Jewish solidarity activists, adopted by mainstream Israelis. So we're talking about divestment, which until recently was seen as, BDS or anti-Semitic and all that. Suddenly you have the heart of the Israeli finance and high-tech sectors, the drivers of the economy, calling for divestment. They're pulling billions of dollars from Israel and transferring them abroad. They're opening new companies in the past 3 months. Almost all new Israeli companies, startup companies that are founded in Silicon Valley and not in Israel. And foreign investors are being told by the people they're investing in, don't bring your money here, invest elsewhere. So that is happening. And at the same time, conscience ejection, which 20 years ago and 10 years ago and 3 months ago was, you would have 5 people a year, a good year, that would actively refuse to go to prison. Suddenly, you have entire units refusing to serve. You have basically the Air Force, the intelligence force, two of the most central parts of the Israeli army, getting to the point where they're almost non-functional because of the numbers of people saying that they will refuse to serve if the judicial overhaul comes through. So that's on the side of tactics. At the same time, we're seeing a change in the values of the movement. I think 2 things are driving them. One is the people that just got out to protest because they were concerned with the attack on what they perceive as their liberal lifestyle, because the government is aiming at women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and free press, and so on. So they're feeling like their lifestyle is under attack, and they started out by going out in those issues, but gradually they realized what's motivating the other side, and they're like, well, if the other side is focusing on this because of occupation, annexation, apartheid, we need to deal with those issues as well. So that is one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening is that people are saying, well, our system of government is so fragile that with about 4 bills that a random majority can pass in Knesset, we turn from being a democracy into a non-democracy. Then our system of government isn't very good. I mean, most countries have mechanisms in place to prevent a random majority from doing something like that. And then people start asking questions of what are those? Oh, other countries have a constitution. Why don't we have a constitution? Because constitution requires the basic notion of equality. All people are equal under the law. That's a basic notion that you need to have in a constitution. So you actually saw people moving from saying we don't want these bills to we want a constitution to we want equality. And as that is happening, the attitude of demonstrators towards the anti-apartheid law, which is still very small, is changing. Gradually, you're seeing people opening up to those messages. And from just seeing Palestinian flags and beating up the people carrying them, asking, well, why are there Palestinian flags here? And we at Parents in Turn Local Call actually wrote a piece saying, title, like, why is there a Palestinian flag here? And we printed out kind of placards with a QR code. So people passing through and asking that question, you can scan that and read. And then they would come back and say, oh, now I get it. Okay. And gradually, people don't stop and join the blog, but tens of thousands of people would pick up like stickers or placards saying no democracy with occupation. Suddenly, just a few weeks ago, I find myself on Ayalon, which is the main highway in Tel Aviv, the entire central area of Israel, which has become kind of the trophy for demonstrators. Block Ayalon, like that's a win. So every week, the demonstrators try and always succeed to block Ayalon for hours on end, setting bonfires and barricades on the road. And I find myself surrounded by tens of thousands of people chanting from the river to the sea, democracy and equality for all. And just literally weeks ago, I literally knew every single Jewish Israeli that was willing to chant that slogan. And now I'm standing there, it's 2 a.m., I'm surrounded by tens of thousands of people waving Israeli flags. I don't know any of them because the radical bloc has already gone to sleep. And these people are chanting democracy from the river to sea, equality from the river to sea. Now, I don't think necessarily we all understand kind of the full scope of what that means or what that looks like, but the fact that conversation is opening up about what this place is about, questions about what does it mean Jewish and democratic? What does it mean in the sense of the relationship between religion and law? What does it mean in the sense of Palestinians living here? Those questions that were suppressed for so many years, and the questions that Netanyahu was successfully putting down for 10 years or 12 years, are suddenly erupting in a way that's completely unprecedented. And people right now are looking for words. They're looking for information, they're looking for analysis, and they're looking for answers as to how things might look different. And that's what we at 972 Local Call are trying to do. We're trying to offer people those words. And we're seeing a spike in our readership, both locally and internationally over the past few months around those things. And that's why I'm here. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much to Haggai. So now we're gonna start with our Q&A. And for the folks over there out in the universe, you're involved too. So anybody. Rick.
Okay, what do you want? Should I do anything like look there or what?
You don't have to.
All of
look.
Okay. For quite a while, it had seemed to me that one of the basic components of Israeli identity, and this is just my opinion, was fear of collective existential death at the hands of the Arabs. Throw them in the sea, which I know Haaretz just proved never happened. Thanks. Okay, so, I saw an article in Haaretz a few weeks ago. They found a bunch of, they allowed people to go into the military archives of 48 and look at Palestinian papers that were found. And they went through an extensive search for the phrase, throw them in the sea, which every Israeli almost, with notable exceptions here, has said, it's obvious, that's what they're about. And they couldn't find that in any written word of any Palestinian in 1948. But nonetheless, whether it was 48 or 67 or 73, one could understand how Israelis felt they were in mortal danger. And it seems like a long time since that was the case. So if that is if the existential fear of the enemy, as it were, is no longer there, is that part of why people can reach out and be dissatisfied with their government, and B, actually look at real democracy where they live, which includes Palestinians, obviously, there is no real democracy. So that's my question. That lack of fear, how does that play out? And do most of these people not any longer feel that the Palestinians are, in the words of my family's, my brother's father-in-law, they can't wait to slit all our throats. That's what he told me, and that's stuck with me.
Thank you. So I think to a degree, yes, I do think there's definitely a sense that things have changed. The notion of this constant battle for survival, where we can be wiped out at any minute, is something that people are questioning. The sense that I think the aftermath of the Arab Spring contributed to that, and the sense that Arab nations around us are basically collapsing. The cumulative experience of just beating Palestinians every single time, every single war, to a degree that's connected to what Netanyahu was successful in doing, just limiting the number of Israeli casualties compared to the number of Palestinian casualties. Just anecdotally, in the first decade of the 2000s, the ratio was about 1 to 5 Palestinians to Israelis killed. In the second decade, it's about 1 to 20. So that sense of we're winning, I think definitely you're right, and it's playing into that on the one hand. On the other hand, there are two things that are working against that. I don't want to kind of be too pie in the sky, everything's great, everybody's waking up, it's going to be just fine, because it's not. Like, yeah, Alon is still on stage promoting these war crimes. I mean, that's also still happening. So the other two things that are happening are one, the people have grown up with this fear. We're right now in this kind of 1 month of the year that starts with Passover and the kind of history of they tried to kill us and we survived and came here and to the promised land. Through Holocaust Memorial Day, they did kill us, they massacred us, genocide. To Memorial Day of all the soldiers sacrificed their lives, to Independence Day, this is how we survive. We have soldiers to protect us and die if need be, so we don't have another Holocaust and we're safe in our country. That basic arc has been really deeply inserted. I grew up with that kind of in mind, and I think most Israelis have that sense still. That's something that's very hard to beat. At the same time, the other thing that I think plays into it, as I was saying before, if you think about the events of May 2021, of a massive Palestinian uprising everywhere, including within 48, in Israel. So people who thought that they have a good life of coexistence with their neighbors, and suddenly their neighbors are coming out to attack them and kill them, are terrible. And as we don't have any answers, there's no significant political camp that says like this is the alternative of equality, they're only struggling between the status quo or the far right, like I was saying. So yes, that's my long-winded answer.
I wanted to ask about. I wanted to ask if the, as you were saying, there's been little repercussion. The world has let Israel do whatever they want to do. There's been no, it's been with impunity. But recently, I think on the 14th of this month, so about 10 days ago, there was a compelling article in Foreign Policy magazine, and for people who don't know, very establishment, pretty much business proud magazine that was actually talking about the divestment, saying that they don't, that they want they want the US government to stop punishing people who participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. They were, really saying a lot of things, and where there hasn't been any repercussion. To your point about divestment and people fleeing, like, is it too soon yet to know whether that is going to make an effect, that maybe our government isn't doing it, but our business community is now standing up and saying,
Thanks. I'm actually really glad you brought up that because we at Lancet are very proud about it, because we've been talking about, as I've been saying, the one sick reality for a very long time. The title of that article was "The One Sick Reality Is Here." So basically saying, it's time we recognize that. We're like, that's a huge win for them to recognize that, huge win. And yeah, I think things are changing. I think business, both internationally and within Israel, is starting to look at things in a different way. And again, there are struggles within these sectors. So if you look at I'll start with the Israeli high-tech and finance sectors that are very much involved in the struggle and in these calls for divestment. On the one hand, they have a vested interest in the appearance of a liberal democracy that has existed probably until now. They want to sustain that. They also have an interest, and they've been investing a lot in Palestinian citizens of Israel and their integration into high tech over the past decade or so. Just recognizing that the two largest growing populations in Israel are the Haredi ultra-Orthodox communities that will probably not go into high tech because they don't learn English and math in their schools, many of them. And you have Palestinian citizens. So if you're seeing these communities grow and you want like a sophisticated workforce, the high tech finance sectors have been investing in Palestinians. So they have a vested interest in equality with Palestinians from a purely financial point of view that has not existed before. So that's something that's been happening. And I think for the international community, both business and otherwise, there's a question of like, where does Israel fall in all sorts of international axes? So the idea of Israel kind of gradually allying with authoritarian regimes, with Hungary, with India, with China, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and that plays into the politics that are happening here. I think liberals here are concerned with the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump, with Kohelet doing its thing both here and there. So I think when you see kind of a business sector that's fighting against what's happening in Israel, it's concerned about those same people doing the same things here. So all that is, on the plus side. At the same time, much of the Israeli finance and high-tech industries are invested in systems of control, surveillance, weapons, and so on, and have been profiting from the systems of apartheid, which is why many of us have been called to boycott them. So you have these, again, as in with everything, this protest movement in this very, very unique moment, you have different forces pulling in different directions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Haggai, for coming here and giving more details how things working there. I have a question that concerns me. Netanyahu have a long history of super manipulation. I can call him he's the master of manipulation. And I believe that he's like in desperate in some way. And he can do anything for his political survival. And one thing on the plate is maybe to arrange a war, a major war, maybe assuming that many people who participate in demonstrations would just drop and join the war and patriotic duty. And it looked like 3 weeks ago he tried and he failed because Hamas, the branch in Gaza or in Lebanon did not follow his, but it's possibly still an agenda. What do you think about this?
So you're very right that starting wars or mini wars is part of Netanyahu's MO to put down resistance. It's been that way for many years. He has faced protest movements in the past and has true to that option exactly. And you're right, that 2 weeks ago, the attack on Al-Aqsa, I think that was an attempt like that. And you're also right that Hamas didn't respond, and he might try something like that on the one hand. But on the other hand, I do feel that unlike in the past, he has a much more limited space for maneuvering. And if we just look at some of the elements here, obviously one of the main, kind of the best war you can start is around Iran, right? And that's been kind of when he came into office this time, the first thing he said is we're going to focus on Iran, and the main way of doing that will be expanding the Abraham Accords to Saudi Arabia, supported by the US. And fast forward 3 months, Saudi Arabia and Iran are normalizing relations under Chinese auspices. The US is basically turning its back on Israel. Biden, when asked, will he even meet with Netanyahu? He said no. And this kind of and this never happened. It's never been the case, at least not in the past 12 years, that an Israeli prime minister that's elected is not invited to the White House immediately and is even disinvited, basically. So it doesn't have the support of the US, doesn't have the support of Europe, it doesn't have the support of Middle East countries, Arab nations that until recently were potential allies vis-a-vis Iran and are now actually normalizing relations with Iran and are not happy with what he's doing. And add to all that, his own army is crumbling. As I was saying before, you have people saying, we no longer trust this government for this exact reason, that if a war is to start, that it's for any legitimate reason. There are people that say, and it's really interesting to listen to some of these new refusers who are saying, until now, we might have proposed the occupation in our politics, but because there was a democratically elected government and the Supreme Court, we felt that there are mechanisms in place we should respect. But if there are no courts and the government is autocratic, and Netanyahu is motivated mostly by his own political survival against several criminal charges that might land him in jail, if those are the motivations of the government, and we can no longer trust the government to operate with pure intentions, then we're not going to participate. So in between all those things, he has very limited maneuver.
There's somebody who has a question.
Yeah,
Been
we
waiting
have a question from online.
from online.
So this seems somewhat related. James Bamford recently published a book and wrote an article in The Nation giving evidence that Israel was actively involved in Trump's 2016 campaign through one of Netanyahu's close associates. As a result, Trump approved the annexation of the Golan and moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, was also persuaded to withdraw from the nuclear freeze agreement with Iran. Has this received any attention in the Israeli or Palestinian press?
No. Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, no. Yeah.
I have kind of a twofold question that's related. So one of the things that I'm struck by, is that I feel like kind of within Israeli society, these protests feel like a game changer, like, wow, things are happening that have never before happened. But I think at least from definitely diaspora Palestinian perspective and just even international media, it's kind of like looking at it and it's like, wait, is this a joke? Like, is this for real? Like, what's happening? And there's a way of like, at least it doesn't seem like Israeli society is really understanding the depth of racism towards Palestinians. So it's not even clear from the outside, like what even are they really protesting? It's just like this new judicial review, but like, do they even have any understanding of what has been happening? So I guess I'm kind of curious to hear you speak a little bit about, yeah, what you see kind of in that international conversation versus on the ground. And if you really feel that there is some major shift, or if you feel like the international perspective has some legitimacy in that. And then like a part two that's related is that I feel like, you know, I speak at a lot of different Jewish communities throughout the world, and I feel like both within Israel and in Europe and in the US, there's still like, regardless of what happens on the ground, there's still so much in the Jewish community that are kind of stuck in a frozen trauma response that are like, defend Israel no matter what. So they don't care that Netanyahu is going to start like 500 million wars, because they're still on that paradigm. And it's been, yeah, I think really concerning to see that that's not really budging in a lot of places. And I'm curious if you see that on the ground too, with like where that budgets.
So I'm actually, it's curious that the internationally people are saying, is this joke? My read of most of the kind of mainstream media outlets are like, Israelis are defending democracy kind of thing. And it's true in Palestinian communities, alternative spaces. I think the mainstream media is too much kind of taken by the narrative of the protests of saying Israel is a democracy and we're defending democracy, which is what we're trying to challenge. We're trying to do both these things, push back against the argument that this is, the pro-democracy camp, and say that there's something that's happening within it that is actually really pro-democracy. Yeah, I think it's very right to question. Palestinians are definitely right to question the motivations here when the whole setup of the protest movement is made in such a way that it would alienate Palestinians, is designated that way. You really see that. The reason, and we know this, the countless reporting on this, the reason that the symbol of this protest movement is the Israeli flag is because in the first few protests, there were mostly, I say mostly, there was like 4 Palestinian flags, and nobody brought any other flags. And the right, like Netanyahu was campaigning on that, saying like, oh, this is all, leftists and pro-Palestinians. And then the organizers said, we are going to drown out the Palestinian flags with Israeli flags. We're going to put generals on stage. We're going to use militaristic iconography. I mean, that is how we're going to build our movement, so the right can't make these claims. And they did that, and they pushed away Palestinian speakers. The few Palestinian speakers that were allowed on stage were severely censored. So there's no question that the movement, as I was saying before, started out that way, and to the greatest extent, the heart of it is still there. At the same time, as I was saying, like things, especially from the ground, are forcing gradual change in the narrative. So you have people like the movement doesn't have like an actual leadership; it's very decentralized, and there are very interesting things happening. So Tel Aviv, for example, is kind of the heart of the protest movement. It's where most people are. It's where the speakers on the stage will be quoted in the media. But there are dozens of other demonstrations. In the other demonstrations, things are changing. And actually, in some of these places, very radical things are happening. So just, they started today, when it was evening there, in the protest in Beersheba, you had Bedouin speakers talking about 75 years of ethnic cleansing on stage, not in the radical bloc in Beersheba, on the main stage in Beersheba, which is a right-wing city. Jerusalem, which is another right-wing city, has had people talking about apartheid for several weeks now. The same has been happening in other demonstrations, and that's happening in stages. Same time, Shikma Blesser, who is well, the agency leadership is seen as a spokesperson for the movement. Started out by saying we're doing this only about the judiciary overall. Recently gave an interview where she said this is a struggle between two parts of Israeli society. One supports equality, the other supports Jewish supremacy. That terminology of both equality and Jewish supremacy, those words were not part of the Israeli political dictionary until a few weeks ago. And she has been sensing that from the ground, people are demanding to talk about these things, and has adopted this kind of reference. So again, I don't want to say that is the movement, and much of the movement is very much stuck in the old paradigms, but it's changing.
What's your name again, Haggai?
Sorry, Shikma Blesler. Shikma Blesler. And the second question, I forgot. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, I definitely see that happening. When I travel here in the U.S., there are definitely a lot of people. I think much more so in the older generations than the younger generations. They're very still about we need to protect Israel no matter what. We can't involve ourselves in what's happening there. Internal Israeli politics is their own issue. We just need to support it. I think they're wrong, but they're there. And I do think that it's changing with the generation. Also, many people, I was talking just yesterday to someone who recently left APAC and started supporting kind of more left-wing politics. And I see more and more people like that are disillusioned. That she actually literally told me for many, many years, for dozens of years, she was supporting APAC out of the sense that Israel victims thought, no longer the victim, speaking what you were saying, Rick. That Israel is no longer the victim. And then I asked her, like, do you feel that this has become a victimizer? She's like, I wouldn't have said that myself, but if you say so, I agree. And she was recently in APAC. So I think there are people that are moving even here. Again, we're far from where we should be. I'm not trying to oversell where we are, but there is a change.
I see you guys are trying to not sleep for anybody.
Thanks, Haggai. We appreciate the presentation. This following quote comes from Yehuda Shauer, who's the founder of OFAC, the Israeli Center on Public Affairs. There was a tweet that he put out yesterday that said 12 Israeli-based peace and human rights organizations sent a letter to EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell and EU foreign ministers urging them to fully acknowledge the Israeli government's acts of annexation and to take concrete measures against them. Do you have any comments about the letter or the impact that European foreign ministers might be able to have in stopping annexation or on limiting its effect?
So I think that question of where the EU is, has been on our minds for many, many years. And again, kind of going back to that Netanyahu quote, I think it was 2009, 2010, he was saying the world will become more like us and we will become like them. I think when you look at the EU and you see that it has to deal, even though you have members countries there, member states that have very serious problems with where Israel is going. It's very difficult to create active action on the side of the EU, where they need to agree in consensus. They have Hungary and Poland, countries that have become more authoritarian, like Israel and our close allies of Israel. So it's very difficult to imagine the EU as a body kind of acting on it. Germany, of course, is a country that proclaims liberal values, is persecuting Palestinians and Jews who are active against apartheid more than Israel does sometimes. So I'm kind of hesitant about relying too much about the EU. We do have some relatively positive comments coming in from France. We can see several countries making small gestures, but we're very far from any of them actually saying Israel is committing war crimes, there's annexation, we're going to boycott Israel. We're very, very far from that.
One of the things I don't think we touched, and to me, it's very, very frightening, is the law that it passed, and has to do with the private army that we're going to be, that Israel is going to give to Benjamin. And that's really frightening. And I think one of the first things that they're going to do, in my opinion, is go into the cities, the mixed cities that have both Arabs and Jews, and they will start a little war there, and from there, maybe they will try to change public opinion, and basically they will definitely appeal to their base. And from there it will go on. And women, sitting in the bus and not be able to go to the same places the men do, and who knows what they're going to do against the demonstration. And they're taking chunks of all others' budget in order to build it. And you all know who's going to be there. It's part of the familia and all those crazy people, nuts that are been here. And what do you think about that?
Sorry, I didn't hear the law that passed.
I'll repeat that.
Okay. I didn't hear the law that passed.
The question was about the law passed, the government resolution basically to give Ben-Gvir kind of his own militia, basically. So, like I said in the beginning, there are many things happening and we can't cover all of them. So you're right that we didn't touch on that. We didn't touch on the fact that one of the moves they're trying to do is to outlaw the Palestinian parties, which will basically guarantee the rights victory for perpetuity, basically. So there are many things we can get to. Specifically on the Ben-Gvir militia, you're very right that it's one of the biggest dangers. If it is formed, it will be dangerous to the Palestinians. You're very right also that one of the far right in the past couple of years, since May of 2021, has really shifted its attention into Israel and to mixed communities. I think it's also a result of the fact that for many years their main campaign was formal annexation. They came as close as they could to it. They had Netanyahu in power, they had Trump in power. It was basically almost like green light, do whatever you want, but it failed. So the sense was that project, the formal annexation, failed, and they turned their attention within to establish supremacy within mixed cities within Israel. It's definitely a project for them. Yes, I agree with all of that analysis. And this is something that protesters are saying, that there's kind of a deal that Netanyahu struck with Ben Gvir, because when Netanyahu decided to freeze the judicial overhaul for just a few weeks for negotiations with the opposition, he was met with backlash from the base. And this is also relevant to recognize that the government is very, very unstable. It doesn't even last, but it has people in Likud that are saying we've gone too far. We need to stop this madness, the religious fanaticism, the attacks on the courts. We need to stop this because we're losing our moderate base. And you have people to the right of Ben Gvir that are challenging him, saying like, where are all your campaign promises? You said you're going to demolish Khan el Ahmar, this Palestinian community, or you said you'd go on against Palestinian sports, and you're becoming a lefty. They're telling Ben Gvir. So he's being outflanked by people further right of him, and for both these reasons, the government is really unstable. So the deal that Netanyahu struck to get Ben Gvir's support to cause the judicial overhaul for just a few weeks was to give him this private militia. But this militia is supposed to come out of the existing police force, to be removed from the existing structure of the police and be made subordinate directly to Ben Gvir. And there are many challenges in their way of making that happen. Yes, there's a lot of the budget for that, but the police itself is fighting against it. Like I was saying before, they're not just facing the protesters, they're facing the police, and they might also face the courts. And we need to recognize that we might be in a scenario not too far from today, where one of the many different things that they're pushing forward, including this militia, and it could be part of the judicial overall, could be also other things. One of these things is struck down by the Supreme Court, and the government says that it doesn't recognize the ruling of the Supreme Court. And then the army, the police, the Shin Bet, public workers need to decide who they're siding with, the courts or the government. I would say constitutional crisis. We have a constitution, but it's those things we have the constitutional crisis. And you already know that the police and the army are basically going to their leadership is going to show loyalty to the courts, but specific units within them will show loyalty to the government, and that could start, infighting between different armed forces. Civil war. It's a term that's been used in Israeli politics for the past few years. It started with a sketch on the most popular political satire show, Eretz Nederetz, our version of Saturday Night Live. They had this sketch 2 years ago, basically saying, in the kind of deadlock of the political crisis, where there was constantly elections after elections, and they had this sketch basically saying, well, the only solution is civil war. We just don't get along. This place is not working. We need to resolve this civil war. We all have guns. Let's go out in the street and solve it, like nations do. Civil wars are helpful. The US had one that turned out well. Syria had one. That's nice. So they had this sketch, and people were mortified because people were skeptical. Everyone was like, could this actually happen? And now people are like resharing that sketch and saying it's about to happen. It's like that's very, very real sense. And in the past few weeks, Netanyahu and the right have been calling on their supporters to go on counter protests, and there have been clashes on the streets between protesters from the two sides, like violent confrontations. Again, a very long-winded answer to say that yes, the militia is very, very dangerous. It's not a very simple process to make that happen, and all sorts of things can go very, very wrong in the process of that happening. But it could also be formed, and it will be very dangerous.
Okay, I see everybody's hand. I also want to acknowledge that we have actually two Palestinians here, and one of them, three. Okay.
Oh, no, actually, I think.
Oh. Okay.
Hello, everyone. I just want to have two comments. As a Palestinian living in Israel, I want to share an accomplishment. Who used to live in Israel? So, an accomplishment from my hometown, which is basically a ghetto within Israel. but I grew up in a Palestinian Israeli village in the north in the Galilee, and it is full-blown ghetto. It has always been, and it will never be a ghetto within Israel. This morning, the head of the municipality posted like a victory that he managed to kind of like recruit 250,000 shekels to build a high school in a village that is almost 18,000 people. So that's how we are treated in Israel. What we perceive the fight over democracy in Israel, we want it to burn, honestly. Like we don't give any, like we don't care about it. We are waiting for the whole system to collapse so that we would say, yes, we are finally free. This place had 75 years to redeem itself from the atrocities that they have done to us, to our ancestors, to the, what is still being happening to this, to that beautiful place. And they choose violence time and time again as if we are supplements. So Palestinians don't really participate. The overwhelming majority, I used to vote for the Israeli Knesset for the Arab parties. I don't see any good coming out of it anymore. They shouldn't participate in it. They should call it for what it is. Jewish supremacist country that is there to make our life living hell day in and day out. That's that. And that's how we see it. That's why I don't put them anymore.
So one thing that wasn't really touched on much is how the government views, in your talk right now, is how the government views demonstrations, right? So do they see them as a threat? Do they think they can just ride it out and continue doing what they want? And the second question is, how do you see it? You think, regardless of how they see it, are they right in your opinion or are they wrong? Here we go.
Okay, so first, thank you, Tara, for your comments. I agree with almost everything you said. I still believe that voting matters and can have an impact. But other than that, I agree with what you said. And your question, the government recognizes the force of this movement. I think Netanyahu made a very untypical mistake when he thought that he can just greenlight all this series of reforms, all different fronts against the media and women, the LGBTQ community, and unions, and basically alienating so many people, including his own base. And in his own base, there are many people who are secular or what's called traditionalists and Sufim, who have a kind of live and let live attitude towards religious questions. And when they're seeing Netanyahu's allies starting to promote the notion and openly talking about what we need is a religious monarchy in the style of King David. You have people in Netanyahu's coalition saying that. They're like, this is not what we signed up for. And that's where you're seeing, even in very clear and staunch Likud voting cities, like Netanya, and Bet Shemesh, and Ashdod, like Likud strongholds and Shas strongholds, you have some of the largest protests against the government. If you see polls that are being held right now, there's a landslide victory for the opposition. The Netanyahu camp is seeing losses that in polls that it has not seen since the 70s. So in terms of public opinion, they're definitely losing. In terms of the force, it's not just the protesters. They need to grapple with the refusal. So, for example, Yoav Gallant, who's the Minister of Defense, started out by supporting the judicial overall, but at some moment said, well, as Minister of Defense and a former general, I can no longer vouch for our ability to sustain the army with so many people refusing. so we need to stop. And the day after that, Netanyahu said he's going to fire him. That sparked the largest demonstrations yet, because people said, he's going full-blown dictatorship, like, one minister is criticizing him, so he's firing him. And he undid the resignation, firing him. And the day after, he announced he's putting a pause to the judicial overhaul. Now, it could be that probably is trying to win time and everything, but on that day, the country came to a standstill. I mean, the universities were in strike, municipalities were in strike, schools were in strike. The airport was shut down, seaports were shut down. The only thing that was working on that day after Gallup was fired was public transportation that the unions allowed to work so people can get to demonstrations. So I mean, you can't. I mean, there's just you can't function anymore as a state. So I think that Netanyahu recognizes that he's trying to break up, like put aside the bills against the unions, for example, so he can bring back the unions. I mean, there's all sorts of things he's trying to do, but he no longer underestimates the power of this protest movement. And neither do I. I think it's very, very powerful. I do think that when we're looking at the current reality, there are two major risks and one cause for hope. The major risk is that Netanyahu is successful, and we will see deterioration on all fronts. The second huge risk is that the mainstream of the protest movement is successful. And we go back to where we were just like 4 months ago, and everything continues as it has been, and it's seen as a victory for democracy, but we're just setting ourselves up to the next May 2021, the next escalation and continued violence against Palestinians. That's another huge risk. And there's a small chance that, kind of this rising voice for equality wins. So that's how I see where we're going.
We've heard a lot of stories about Israeli Jews who are trying to get passports to other countries or are thinking of moving. So I wonder, these are my questions about that. Is it exaggerated? Is it just more of the same, since cities like Los Angeles, Miami, and New York, and London, Berlin are already filled with tons of Israeli expats who went there for economic or political or educational reasons? Or is it a fear of Ben Gvir and people like that they'll be a victim of the militias? Or is it a fear of loss of the Jewish superiority? How do you analyze that?
It's not overestimated at all. I don't know anyone, and I mean anyone, and talking about like my friends, they're in kind of the radical left, but also, parents, my kids' school. I just don't know anyone who's not either looking to get a foreign passport, is kind of reviewing their foreign passport, is looking into where would it be best to go. There are groups of people organizing, trying to see, is it best to move to Athens, to Berlin, Italy, Portugal, the States. It's on everybody's minds. It's not something that you can say is marginal at all. And I think the reason is, there are different reasons. Some are saying because we don't want to live in a theocratic monarchy. But even without that, even people who are very involved in the protests and are very optimistic about their win, people are looking at the demographics. Just recently, a few days ago, Moshe Koppel, who's the head of the Health Forum, said if we lose now, it will only take a couple of years before we do this thing again. And that next time we win, because ultra-Orthodox communities, religious communities just have more kids, they're growing, they will win the demographics. And when you have people, and I'm looking at this from a very, very kind of liberal, middle of the road Israeli kind of perspective that I'm actually somewhat critical of it, but I understand. People are saying well, we are, and these are the people that, high tech, finance, the people that are motivating the Tel Aviv protests. And they're saying no matter what happens next, even if we win, that's where we're going. We're going to live in a country where we are the only ones who are in kind of advanced economy of the 21st century, and we pay the taxes and we serve in the army. And the ultra-Orthodox, they don't pay taxes and they don't go to the army, and we have to serve them for their religious wars and suffer kind of their increasing influence over politics and an increasingly theocratic nation. So their thinking is even if we win, we need to compete. So yeah.
Thank you guys for showing up today. I really appreciate it. We learned a lot and been taking notes about what you were saying, because you really seem to have a hand on the pulse of things happening in Israel. On the tail end of what the gentleman who was saying at the Palestinian was saying, so obviously there are people out there, hundreds of thousands, and then demonstrating. It seems like the prevailing sentiment is, against the judicial overhaul thing, and then maybe other things are not muted, sort of marginalized or sidelined. As to the other Israeli who sits at home and is not out there, not particularly vocal, and may or may not be interested in anything that's remotely digestible for Palestinians in terms of a peace plan. What is your sense of that? The proverbial silent majority, as it were? Is a sort of a tandem question. What is your feeling about Israeli youth? Okay, they're coming of age in political maturity, specifically in a few years, and in conjunction with that, Palestinian youth, vis-a-vis the dynamic of there's a crisis of confidence in protracted Palestinian leadership that nobody's been satisfied with.
Well, I think, first of all, there's no one who's not involved. Even if people aren't demonstrating, you cannot not be talking about this. Whether you're on a bus, in the grocery store, it's the only conversation in cafe, like it's the only conversation that there is. So there's really nobody who doesn't have an opinion. Who's like, yeah, whatever happens, happens. And and really, I kind of overstate how disruptive this movement is in people's lives when the Saturday night protests, but there's also, as I was saying, like strikes, and when the Knesset was in session, now it's not when it was in session, once a week at daytime, there would be days of disruption, basically shutting down the main highways, public transportation, the ports. You actually had people in boats kind of creating a mini siege around the seaports, shutting down marine transportation. I mean, so you can't ignore it. Nobody's sitting at home ignoring it. And you also don't have an average Israeli. You have very, very different. Israel is a very deeply polarized tribal society, we call it, where you have very different strands of people. You have ultra-Orthodox communities, most of which are very happy with what the government is doing and support it. You have the far right that support it very much. Settlers are actually torn. You have kind of far right settlers that support it, but also settlers that are demonstrating against it. It's the most bizarre scene to see demonstrations of settlers in the settlements campaigning for democracy. And they don't mean democracy for their neighbors. So you have that. You have, and again, too much to go into all of this, but you have the whole Mizrahi vote. And there's a whole discourse around that, because the government is trying to portray the protest movement as Ashkenazi and elitist, and trying to, and there's the whole, didn't talk about kind of the Israeli Fox News that has grown over the past year, Channel 14. There's whole kind of media ecosystem talking about there being a deep state that's supported by the CIA, which is run by Obama and Soros, and that controls kind of the main junctions of the liberal media. Like, you know, these things, I'm not, but we just have our own version of it. It's literally like Obama, the CIA, Soros, and the deep state. And a lot of people believe that because there's a whole media ecosystem talking about that. And part of it is saying that this is an Ashkenazi movement to oppress Mizrahi people. And you have, for example, from Air Force, where this is really interesting to see, where you have many of the pilots are Ashkenazi, and you have many of the tech teams supporting the pilots are Mizrahi. And you actually have on certain bases people saying, we will not, the pilots saying, we will no longer fly these planes if the overhaul passes. And you have the tech team saying, we will not arm your planes if the overhaul doesn't pass. So again, very, very polarized. And you were asking about the youth.
Well, I'm so sorry to question my question with all due respect. Thank you for investing me for with a panel. Do any of them or most of them even give a shit about Palestinians?
If anyone cares about Palestinians, so
Yes.
the vast majority no. The vast majority just, or I would say this: either they don't care, or if they care, it's for the wrong reasons. So it would be like, the liberal media is trying to kind of give our land to Palestinians and to immigrants, and that kind of thing. So that's the discourse. We need to protect ourselves against Palestinians and be more militarized. And that's kind of the Ben-Gvir narrative. On the youth, there are youth that are protesting, but generally speaking, in conjunction with what I was saying before about the demographics, for two main reasons. Unlike many places in the world, Israeli youth is more to the right than the older generation.
That's what I understand.
Both because of the demographics, just because the religious people have more kids, but also because if you recognize the difference of how people have grown up. I'm almost 40, and I grew up in the 90s, like for my formative years. And even though I have a lot of criticism of the Oslo process and so on, I grew up in a reality where peace was something that was talked about, like I said before. Like there was a time when people were aspiring for peace, where even if Netanyahu was elected in 96, campaigning on peace, basically, he used that word. It's important because he realized that without campaigning for peace, he can't win. We grew up in a world where people were being told, maybe when you grow up, you won't have to go to the army. But that's my generation. The following generations that were born, in 2000 or after, grew up to a world where there's no such discourse, where the kind of Netanyahu attitude of we will forever live on our sword is the only game in town. So those kids are much more to the right than their parents, but have a memory of maybe another world is possible.
Thank you, Ryan.
Hi, Nor, thank you for talking, for your work and excellent coming. Nor started touching about it, but I think it's maybe something worth covering for an American audience who's not exposed to the nuances of this protest movement. But there's a lot of voices, including on the left, that says it's white. This protest movement has a whiteness problem to it, right? Sort of as a famous LP and all these coalitions and advocating for a. This goes back to what Tarek was saying and Agar was saying, so better racism within this protest movement. You already touched on it right now in your comments and earlier when we talked about more the leaders of this protest movement. So it's more of an invitation to speak about this, sort of divisions around class and race within the protest movement. How is that playing into it? Rather than question, but I think maybe worthwhile touching on much money.
Yeah, so again, there's so much to it. In Israel, there's the whole connection between ethnicity and class. That's definitely an issue. And also to add to that, the question of citizenship. So you have on your lowest level of people living in the outside of people who don't have citizenship, they're on reputation, they're asylum seekers, they're migrant workers, they're illegal, and then you have Palestinians, and then you have Ethiopians and there's definitely that stratification that cross-sects ethnicity, race, and class. That does exist. And the protest movement does have that issue quite recently. That is something that the right is campaigning on successfully, but there's more to it than that. I mean, and like I said before, we've passed the phase. There was a phase at the beginning that it was much more kind of centered in the liberal communities that are very white, that are very racist, and you hear that. You have just anecdotally two of the most prominent Mizrahi activists in Israel have shared stories of their experiences in demonstrations. One of them went to a demonstration in Jerusalem and was just listening to a conversation next to him, and these two people were saying, "You're not going to see any Moroccans come to this protest." And you know, he turned to them and said, "Well, I'm Moroccan." And another shared that he was in the protest in Tel Aviv, and he was in the kind of anti-apartheid bloc, and two women came up to him and said, like, everything that's happening now is because of you, because you've been campaigning on Mizrahi rights, and that turned Mizrahis against the left, and that gave rise to Neoliberalism. So the Mizrahi discourse is to blame not the years of oppression, not the years of Ashkenazi elitism. So that problem exists. At the same time, the protest movement has grown far beyond that phase. And right now, if you look at the leaders of the unions that started the strikes, they're all Mizrahi. If you look at the leaders of the municipalities that started the strikes, they're all Mizrahi. Some of the main speakers on stage are Mizrahi, and they refer to that identity. And the same goes to where demonstrations take place. So like I said before, like in the Kud and Shas strongholds that are Mizrahi communities, like Nefania and Kiryat Shmona and Bet Shemesh and Ashdod. So very much, you still have kind of the right trying to campaign on that, but increasingly failing because Mizrahi communities are very much concerned with the rise of religious fanaticism that will impact them. They might not care about Palestinians or they don't necessarily like reports too much, but this idea of theocracy that's being promoted is a threat to them, and they're speaking up against that.
All right. So I think we're gonna do, you guys, we'll do a few questions. We'll do one after the other, then Haggai will take.
Okay, I had a question about how all of this is like presented in the media, because at least where I'm standing, like international media, you only hear about the Israeli democracy protests like completely separate from the apartheid, like it's not even mentioned. And you barely hear about the apartheid at all. And I was wondering, like, if these protests being like this big of a deal is like helping maybe like some people realize, oh, the Israeli government isn't great, and like, oh, maybe like study more into the apartheid, like you said, that people were like picking up stickers and scanning QR codes, or if it's more like drowning out the discourse that we have about like Israel, Palestine, like apartheid, and just like maybe, like you said, like moving back to like the status quo, if it's like taking away from that fight, like, or the attention in the media, especially because I don't know how it's being reported in Israel, Palestine.
My question is about, like the function of hope. I think you've expressed like quite a bit more optimism today than I anticipated. I think that sort of like makes me want to be hopeful, but I think also I'm still filled with like the sense of cynicism, especially seeing, like we swarmed with Israeli flags at these protests. It just makes me think like this is pure bread and circus. So I'm just wondering, at what point, like Jewish hope comes at the expense of Palestinians, and at what point it's sort of like an illusion, and when it's like necessary, or productive.
Hey, thanks for speaking. Can you just say a few words on Peter Beinart's new article where he's talking about another Nakba and whether installing Smotrich and Ben Gvir and all these policies are a way of chasing out Palestinians from Israel proper and maybe the West Bank?
Sure, I'll actually start backwards. I haven't read Peter Beinart. Was that published recently, the past couple of days? Because I've been on the road and I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, the 19th, yeah.
Okay, but there's been this talk for a long time. We've also published about this. There is a growing discourse on the right, and I can try to reference that briefly in my opening remarks. There is a growing discourse on the right of the solution is a second Nakba. Kind of the Ben Gvir and Smotrich camp is basically offering that, sometimes more explicitly and sometimes less, but basically what they're pushing for is that. That's what, you know, the courts and kind of all those mechanisms of the state that have allowed and facilitated and been complicit in the system of apartheid and ethnic cleansing all these years have, you know, to a degree not allowed is, you know, full-blown second Nakba, you know, of the kind we've seen in 48. So they're definitely going there. And again, I haven't read Peter, but I'm sure it connects to that. On the question of hope and hope, and I think what I'm seeing is less about hope, and I see how I can pass, you know, hopeful. But my point is less about hope and more about opportunity. I still think that if I had to kind of assess what are the chances, I said before, like, you know, there are three possible main scenarios, like a very dangerous Netanyahu win, a very dangerous protest movement win, and, you know, the chances of something actually good happening. But that's the slitherest of all three. I mean, the two main options of a terrible Netanyahu and a terrible win for an opposition, if one is to sustain things as they are, those are the chances that one of those two things happens to a certain degree. The reason I might sound hopeful is because as someone who's been trying to do this work and get both Israelis and people internationally to pay attention to apartheid and to care about it and to act upon it and speak upon it, I have never, in more than 20 years of activism and journalism, seen more openness and more readiness for that discussion than I'm seeing now. And again, it might be that the powers that are fighting against this openness will overcome. It's very likely, they're very, very powerful. But I'm just trying to make the most of this moment. And I think it's worthwhile trying to do that. And I definitely recognize why Palestinians might not feel the same and don't feel the same. And actually many Palestinians that I know are saying, well, the current scenario is actually what we're seeing right now is actually the best that we've had in a long time. I have a friend in Hebron that recently said, this is the first time in history that we in Hebron are represented in the Israeli government. Itamar Ben-Gvir from Hebron is a minister in the government. It's the first time that someone from Hebron is in the government. And that's really helpful for us. And it's not helpful because he's actually represented. It's helpful because he's out. until now, Israel was able to kill Palestinians en masse and tell the world that it wants peace and coexistence. And now Israel is killing Palestinians en masse and saying that it wants to kill more Palestinians. And if you ask many Palestinians, they would tell you it's more helpful for Israel to be sincere than to try and hide what it's doing. So in that sense, again, the dangers of like something like the previous government, the government change, are very considerable. That suddenly it will seem like there was this win for democracy, and Gantz is the knight in shining armor that saves Israeli democracy. Very, very dangerous. I agree with that. And then lastly, on the media, yes, I agree with you. I think yes, the media is focusing very much on that narrative of a fight for democracy. I think it's a very dangerous narrative, as I was saying. And really, that's where we come in, where we're trying to challenge that. And we're trying to push the conversation there. I can take to some limited success. And I think that recent piece in Foreign Affairs, the test you mentioned before, is an example of that. The fact that many of our team members have a problem keeping up with their regular chores on the site because they're booked up with interviews is excellent. We had team members on Free Save and on Madi Hassan and on Democracy Now! And on mainstream media outlets like Al Jazeera and Greek television and Italian radio. Like we're being interviewed now than we've ever been, more than we've ever been, because people are gradually starting to listen to those shifts that are happening. We're trying to kind of draw attention to. So I agree that the mainstream scenario discourse is very problematic. We're trying to change that, and I hope you have this.
Yeah.
In the local Los Angeles paper, there was a front page. And the bottom line was that the author saw some hope because this might be an entree into creating a constitution for Israel. What's your assessment of something like the Constitutional Assembly gathering promoted?
I will have 2 mics, but I'm getting my steps in, so it's fine.
Thank you so much. I was a little bit late, so you might have touched on this earlier, but I'm curious if you can comment a little bit on what's happening within the Palestinian society, especially like the emergence of the Lion's Den, and like, you know, more willingness, I think, again, for armed struggle. And I think in understanding and support of that within the international left, and how that might be changing the dynamics, and if that's entering into the conversations at all with the protests that are happening in Israeli civil society.
Following up on Pete's question, to the degree that the may or may not be, I mean, his clamor is a sort of I should have phrased this. To the degree that it may or may not, you know, if we're calling for constitutionality, to the degree that it may or may not be a vision or traction to that very idea, how much do you think a constitution, if at all, would be more, you know, something that is more like managed apartheid rather than one that is really based on equality?
So I don't think there's going to be a constitution. A constitution requires considerable support from different parts of society. And the reason we haven't had a constitution for all these years is because nobody can agree, but society is so polarized, nobody can agree on that. Some would say to sustain Jewish supremacy, for others, to make sure that gender inequality can be sustained in ultra-Orthodox communities. There are all sorts of reasons. That's actually the very, very beginning of Israel in 48, 49. They wanted to start write a constitution, and it was the ultra-Orthodox who said, you know, equality is not a value we're willing to sign on to. And so that very question has basically not changed in 75 years. And therefore, I don't think there will be a constitution, but there may be a breakup or reorganizing things in all sorts of wonderful ways. Again, very small chance. Constitution, I really don't see happening. So that's both questions. And then on Palestinian society, like it's a whole other conversation, perhaps for a whole other evening. But Palestinian communities are concerned with very, very, very different things than where Israeli society is at right now. For Palestinians within Israel, the main conversation is organized crime. It's a huge deal. Organized crime is killing dozens of people in Palestinian communities within Israel. And police is allowing that, sometimes allying with organized crime syndicates, and allowing that. We had a big investigation about that. A game changer, I would say, but not enough to actually put an end to that. So that's where Palestinians within Israel are at. In the West Bank, the gradual collapse of the PA, and people basically setting up local alternatives and alliance stems. One of them, so you have your kind of the solution that people in Nablus create for themselves, people in Hebron create for themselves, and other people in Jenin. Like basically, it's every community to itself. And yes, more and more turning to armed struggle. And the protest movement is not really talking about that. It's not something that's being discussed. And most of the violence still coming from Palestinians is not organized violence. It's kind of lone wolf attacks. So we are seeing a lot of those, in part in relation, not with, I don't think it's kind of strategic around what's happening within Israeli society. It's about just a response to the increasing oppression. As I've been saying, it's May 2021 and before, and the previous government, like this ongoing thing of oppression, administrative detention, demolition, all that has been going on and has been breeding more and more violence. Still, most of it is not organized. But to the extent, it's not, to the extent that it is being discussed, it's only by the conservative parts of the protest movement saying, to be able to fight Palestinian terrorism, we need to have an independent judiciary. So, more questions? Okay, so I will just make a final small comment. Okay.
The city of Beersheba, in the last 2 months or more, on a regular basis, there are at least 1 or 2 Palestinian speakers. If they made it a standard for right now, no other cities, but in Beersheba, they did it all the time. Even some of my friends talk about it, but they make it, and also last night, Yeah. No, in Tel Aviv, there was a Bedouin speaker last night, but it's not consistent in Tel Aviv. But in Beersheba, it's every.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like I said, I mean, it has been happening more and more outside of Tel Aviv in more and more places. Actually, there's an entire organization devoted to having more Palestinian speakers on stage. And it's gotten to the point where last week, I think they got to 30 cities where there were Palestinian speakers. So mostly outside of Tel Aviv, where the whole spotlight is on the protest movement there. And in other places, it's easier to kind of experiment and bring in Palestinians. So there is a shift happening there, definitely. I want to close this by really thanking you. We've come here, spend a long time together in this conversation. There's a lot to unpack, as you've heard, and so many other things we haven't touched on. But really, thank you for coming. I do want to ask you to follow 972 if you haven't been doing so. Over there, we have a sign-up sheet for our newsletter. We send out weekly essay kind of capturing where things are in a weekly recap of all our stories of the week. That's it. So please do sign up, do share our information with others. And if you can support financially, because we're independent media and we depend on, we don't have the outdone chicks and the Jeff Gas that supports coherently we have you guys. So to the extent that you can support, please do. And again, thank you for coming. Thank you for organizing.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. And thanks to all of you and all the questions, and keep the questions coming. And if they're interested in following you, how can they do that?
Yeah, no, so like I said, the sign up sheet for our newsletter, that's the best way because social media is not a good way to follow anything anymore. I just lost my blue tape. As you know. No, but yeah, you can follow us on Twitter and on Instagram and Facebook, and we have a podcast that's on hold right now, but you can listen to that. But the really best way is to sign up for the newsletter.
Great. Okay, thanks, everybody.